And I'd come home at night, and the last thing I want to hear is some kids singing my song badly under my window when I'm trying to sleep, because I had to get up early the next day and make this show. And they used to do it. They did it for a couple of days, and I used to chase them with the intent to murder.
Radio personality Bobby J sings with the modern version of the Teenagers.
The story of the Teenagers singing under Richard's window is a little embellished, and I think if there was any under the window encounter, it was because they were pestering him to take them downtown to George Goldner and G Records, where he was not only recording, he was George's A&R man.
Barrett finally agreed to set up an audition for the Teenagers at G Records. Frankie was still just the squirt who sang background, but again, luck was on his side.
The famous story goes,
legend has it,
Herman Santiago came down with the flu.
And George Goldner,
he says, let the little kid try. Let me hear. Frankie sang the song.
And that's how we came about. I think he had a stronger voice, and it didn't matter who sang it as long as it happened.
Frankie sang a tune he and the guys wrote called Why Do Birds Sing So Gay? Goldner signed them on the spot and released their song with the more masculine title, Why Do Fools Fall in Love?
You knew, listening to it, it was going to be a smash, and the rest of it was history.
The song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, hit the charts and rose so quickly. Everybody had this monumental thing that they didn't know what to do with, and so they threw them out there quickly, and it changed their lives. It changed their lives.
And not necessarily for the better. Coming up, the Teenagers go from media darlings to musical dropouts, and Frankie Lymon flirts with the dark side of fame. In 1955, Frankie Lymon was just a 13-year-old pipsqueak from Harlem who wanted to sing with the big boys. But by January of 1956, the song Why Do Fools Fall in Love was burning up the charts. And suddenly, Frankie Lymon was the voice behind a rock and roll revolution.
Frankie was the most energetic, charming, charismatic, tiny person on the planet at the time.
I was 11 when that record came out, and it was the first time I really felt like this is ours, my generation.
Ronnie Spector, pioneering lead singer of the Ronettes, grew up in Harlem and knew Lymon.
I was in love with Frankie. I was in love with Frankie from the time I was 12 years old. And when I heard Why Do Fools Fall in Love on the radio, I didn't know if he was black, white. All I knew was he had the greatest voice I'd ever heard.
It was the maturity in how he sang his words, how he approached a song. He sang like a grown-up.
The precocious 13-year-old also behaved like a grown-up. And why not? For most of 1956, Frankie and the Teenagers toured with performers who were often twice their age.
We were hungry for girls, as all boys are. We saw how adult singers were womanizers, and so we copied that. Those guys were our role models.
Singer Jimmy Castor often traveled with Frankie in the group and sings lead with the modern version of the Teenagers.
Frankie would be with women at 14 and 15 years old, women who were, 25 and older, and he could handle that.
But women weren't the only vices the tiny teen idol discovered on the road.
There was alcohol, and occasionally we might see someone smoking marijuana. I experimented with drinking naturally, and I think that we all did a little bit, But remember, we were still 17 years old. Frankie was 13.
They were introduced to all of these things, and Frankie was introduced, and of course he was a tough guy, and he felt that he could do whatever he wanted and he got hooked.
It wasn't long before the street-smart young heartthrob began flirting with heroin, and there was even more trouble ahead. Remember, 1957 was still the early days of rock and roll, and the business was run by some pretty tough customers. One of those tough guys was reputed mob associate Morris Levy. In '57, Levy took over the small label where Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers recorded. He also began managing the group.
Morris Levy, he was part of the evil element. He was responsible for us being ripped off for the money that the music that we created earned.
It is my understanding that Morris was probably the catalyst to separate the Teenagers from Frankie Lymon to create two acts, of course, looking upon Frankie as the super attraction.
Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers released a half-dozen hits in a little more than a year. But by the time the group finished their triumphant European tour in May of '57, new manager Morris Levy had convinced 14-year-old Frankie that he'd be better off flying solo.
Frankie was all for the idea of a record being released with just him by himself on one side, and we had a confrontation about that. And Frankie ran out of the hotel room. And when he returned, when we did see him again, it was, I'm leaving the group. I'm out of here.
And just like that, after a year and a half of unprecedented success, the kid who once begged to sing background was now standing alone in the spotlight.
18 months seems to be a magic number in rock and roll. Between the time Little Richard had Tutti Frutti and the time he got religion, 18 months. Buddy Holly, between the time That'll Be the Day hit and the time the plane went down, 18 months. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, legend, 18 months. Isn't that amazing?
Devastating is more like it. The bitter breakup cost the Teenagers their career, but it would cost Frankie Lymon even more. Up next, the death of a child star. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers went from harmonizing on Harlem street corners to being the most influential teen group in the world. In 1957, they released their 8th and final single, Out in the Cold Again. It was a fitting title because after a red-hot 18 months, that's exactly where the Teenagers were. But luck was also running out for Frankie Lymon. 1957's Frankie Lymon at the London Palladium was the former Teenagers' first solo effort. Unfortunately, it was filled with pop standards that went nowhere. Even worse, Frankie's voice was changing. And by age 17, Lyman's signature boy soprano was history. But Frankie had an even bigger problem.
Frankie was introduced to heroin rather early on in his stardom. That kind of addiction is a progressive thing. It only gets worse.
As Frankie suffered the failure of his second solo album in 1958, his drug habit grew.
This was somebody who wanted to maintain the success that he had had as a 13 and 14-year-old. And now he's 17, and he's away from his group. He's pretty much out on his own with people who are not in his corner manipulating his career.